Welcome to this week's Knowledge Nibble, where we'll be considering motor learning and the plastic brain. Okay, so when we're thinking about exercises, or rather when we're discussing them between us, or we're talking about the benefits of the exercises that we use, we tend to talk about things like strength, and range of movement. So things that we can measure outwardly, like muscle mass will increase and range of movement we can measure will increase. But what I want to talk to you more about today is how we develop skill and why it's so important. So first of all, let's think about neuromotor control then. What is neuromotor control? So neuromotor control is coordination of muscles and the nervous system. So the coordination between the muscles and the nervous system, and you'll often hear me discuss the brain-body connection, which is how I tend to talk about this. And the reasons why it's so important is that we can reduce the risk of injury. So if the muscles are firing correctly and everything's in a good balance, we can reduce injury risk. And obviously this is very important for us if we're rehabilitating animals, because they've already been injured, so we want to reduce the chance of them being re-injured or an injury happening somewhere else in the body. So it's very important in rehab. It's also very important when you're just working with animals to condition them, because we obviously a massive thing we want to do is reduce the risk of injury in our animals. So the other thing then with rehabilitation is we want to regain function. So I put here motor relearning. So we're going to talk about motor learning, but actually what we're doing very often is motor relearning. So they've already got an established neural pathway and we want to change that. So we have to relearn how to do a movement and how to do it correctly. So when we're looking at rehabilitation, we're wanting to regain function is one of the main things that we'd like to achieve. It's also important for performance. So if we want an increase in performance, we obviously want skill, we want refined movement. So for example, a performance horse, let's say doing dressage, would get higher marks if they have more skill in their movements and they're more precise. The same with a jumping horse or a jumping dog. They need to be able to have skill in turning quickly and actually making the jump and clearing the fence. So there's lots of ways in which this neuromotor control, this training that we can do, will also help increase performance. And then something that I want to point out and what we're going to discuss today, I'd like to sort of take a little bit of a different view on exercises for you. So movement actually happens in the brain. Let's think about neuroplasticity then. So the brain is plastic, it can change. Every time you use a new skill, there is a physical change in the brain. So I want you to think of, sometimes I find it helpful to think about memories and how memories are formed, because when we think about memories, we just think of something, what is a memory? It just floats about in the air, doesn't it? What is a memory? But it doesn't actually just float about in the air. It's actually a physical change. So a memory is some code in your brain that's actually physically formed there. It's a very complex subject, that, but I find that easy to think about. If I think about, well, what is a memory? Does it just float about? Or no, it's actually a physical change in the brain. And so the same is with a movement. What is a movement? Every time you learn anything, you learn a new skill, there is actually a physical change in the brain. And I've put here, by the end of this knowledge nibble, your brain will not be the same as when you started. The brain is just a phenomenal thing, far superior to any computer that we could ever create. And it's always constantly adjusting to the environment and to the input that we put into it. And so, it changes all the time. It's plastic, it changes all the time. The good thing about that is we can change it to our benefit. But yeah, so like I say, by the end of this knowledge nibble, your brain will not be the same as when you started. So that's quite cool, I think. And so there are three ways in which neuroplasticity can occur. So we have a chemical change. We can have a chemical change in the brain. So this is the short-term change. Let me give an example of this. If somebody would try to teach me guitar, let's say, or piano, which, by the way, I'm rubbish at both of those. By the end of the first lesson, I would be able to put together a tune that they've shown me to do. And so that's just due to chemical changes in my brain, signaling pathways changing, meaning that in that moment I can learn to do something and demonstrate it in that moment. But what happens then is that doesn't stick. And so what we're looking at, what we want to occur eventually, is a structural change in the brain. And like I say, it's very sort of enlightening to think about this actually as a structural change in the brain rather than just, something that they're learning. Oh, can you do this? Yes, I can make this change. I can do this movement. You're actually making a structural change in the brain. And that's where your long-term patterns are developed. And then as you use a brain region, it becomes more and more excitable. So when we go on to look at functional change, it becomes more and more excitable, and then it's easier to use again. So as you fire up different areas in your brain, they become easier to call on and to use again. So this is when function is where the brain sort of shifts how and when these excitable areas are activated. And really, these three are more of a symphony carrying on with the musical theme. They don't really happen stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's more of a symphony between them, and it's always occurring. Your brain is always changing and adapting to what the input that you put in. I've put an image of a tree here just to sort of try to get for you to envisage what happens in your brain. So if you imagine a tree, let's think about a seed. So let's say a seed then is a new exercise or a new skill that you're teaching an animal. So that would be the seed. So when you have a seed in the ground, you effectively have a tree, but it's still in a seed form. And that will not, if you don't give that light and give that water, it will never grow. It will just be a seed on the day and then it will disappear and die. So it needs to be nurtured. So you can think about when you give your training or you do a session with an animal, you're creating that chemical change and you're laying a seed. But then what we need to do is we need to water that seed every day, and we need to give it light every day and nutrients from the soil so that it can grow. And this takes time. So when you're trying to learn a new skill, or you're trying to teach an animal a new skill, it takes time. It cannot be done quickly because your brain has to physically change, or their brain has to physically change. And so unless you repeat over and over again unless you water and give light to the seed, it's not going to grow. So what happens then is you start to develop roots, you start to develop in the brain what looks like a tree. And this is a little area which is that pathway, that neural pathway, and that's specific for that particular movement. So the thing is with neural pathways, though, they can be positive or they can be negative. So quite often when we are asked to see an animal, there are negative pathways in place, and they already know an incorrect movement. And what we want to do is change those negative pathways into positive pathways. And the way we need to try to do that then is through motor learning. So motor learning, repetitive motor learning, so teaching of a skill, will become a motor skill, which is a series of automatic movements. So for example, when you ask an animal to walk forward, they don't consciously think, okay, I need to engage my core, I need to flex my lumbosacral joint, I need to flex my hip, put my weight backwards, lighten the front end a little bit, keep my head in a nice neutral position and push forward from the back. They don't think about that. That is just a skill that's ingrained in them, or hopefully is, but probably isn't if they've come to us. So that's just something that automatically happens. They just think, I'm moving over here, and a series of movements or series of firing of muscles and sequences happen to get them from A to B. And the problem that we have then is what an animal will often actually do is throw the weight forward onto their forelimbs, raise their head and neck, which hollows their spine, extends their spine, and doesn't engage their hind end, so they don't actually move forward properly. They pull the self forward from the front, and that is an incorrect pattern. And so, but that is a subconscious pattern. So they already have that pattern ingrained. They've got the tree for that in their brain. They've got the pattern for that in their brain. And so automatically, if you say go from A to B, that's the strategy they will use to get there. And so, like I say, that's a subconscious strategy. So in order to teach them, in order to start to change these processes in the brain, we need to move that from the subconscious to the conscious. So we start to say to an animal, here we go, we're going to move forward, but we're going to do it like this. And it becomes conscious. So the animal has to think, what are they asking me to do? Bearing in mind, we can't explain it to animals, so they don't even understand why we're doing this. So that's why we have to do lots of encouragement and have to, use treats or whatever we need to use to try to encourage them to move in a new way. So we give them the instruction to move in a new way. And we bring that into their conscious mind and they're thinking about it. And then ultimately what we want is eventually to that motor pattern to become so established that it goes back into the subconscious mind and it becomes an automatic movement. And then it's something that when they engage to move forward and go from A to B, they'll use this new pattern that we've taught them, not the old dysfunctional pattern. And so that's how motor learning turns eventually into a motor skill. But like I say, this can be positive or negative. So it's really important to note that we want to try to promote those positive pathways rather than the negative ones. This is the same with learning or any sort of mental health problems. If any of you suffer with any sort of depression or anxiety or have done in the past, or intrusive thoughts, for example, you have these negative trees in your brain, if you like. And so it takes a lot of mindfulness and stuff to grow new trees and change the way in which your brain actually thinks. And so we need to think about individuality. So this is really important. There is the way in which you learn a motor skill, or how motor learning occurs is individual to that individual. And they've shown this in stroke patients and humans. So they'll give a protocol that they think should just work for everybody, and it doesn't. And it's the same. Why would you might be able to learn piano really easily. I might get the same teacher, the same amount of training, and I just might not be able to do it. And that's because our brains are so complex and there's such a makeup of all the things that have happened in our lives and everything about us. It's absolutely impossible that one brain is the same as another brain. So there is an individuality to this, and that's why it's really important that we reevaluate our cases and we change things if they're not working. And also, age can be a factor. So they say you can't teach old dogs new tricks. Well, you can actually, but it just takes longer. So an older brain will need a bit more time to adjust and to make these plastic changes. Also, a brain that has been doing something, a movement pattern, for example, for a long time, will need longer to be able to make the changes as well. And so I want you to think about the fact that we're driving these changes. There's some fascinating work. If any of you do suffer with any sort of mental health, we all suffer from time to time with mental health issues, and it's particularly prevalent at the moment after COVID and everything. If any of you do suffer with anything like that, then I encourage you to go and look at the work of Dr. Caroline Leaf. And she does some fascinating work on this with memories, and she's got a very specific way in which she recodes the brain, if you like, rewires the brain to learn to react differently to the thoughts that you have. And it's fascinating stuff, but it's all very similar to what we're doing here. Any sort of learning is the same. And so you need to understand that you can build the brain in the animals that you want. You can build the brain that you want, but you can also build the brain that you want in the animals, and you need to drive the changes. So you need to be very intentional and specific about what skills you're teaching them and what you're asking them to learn. And what we're going to do there then is create new pathways. So if an animal has a poor movement pathway, we have to create the new pathway. So in my previous example, where you're asking the animal to move forward in a different way than they were before, they don't have that pathway. So they can't just automatically do it. They have to think, I need to do it in this way at first. So you need to first lay down that new pathway, and then you strengthen that pathway through repetition, through encouragement, and eventually that pathway will strengthen. So I've written here, tend the garden, which you can't see because it's under my timer, but just looking at this garden of weeds here, flowers, wild garden. I am not a gardener, as you can probably tell. And I wouldn't know in this picture what is a weed and what is a flower. The only weed I know about is ragwort. Seem to be always digging that out of our fields for the horses. But what I do know is that the more and more I dig out the ragwort, the less ragwort we have in our pastures, the more grass that we have. Because as I take away the ragwort and take away its strength, then the grass has more to grow with and the grass will flourish. And it's the same if we look at this picture of this garden. What you need to think over the long term, it's not a quick change. You're not going to go in here and just cut the heads off the weeds, because it's going to work immediately. You're going to see no weeds, but the roots are still there. So we need to do this over time. You need to dig the roots out, the weeds out by the roots. And so if you have a garden of wildflowers and you tend the garden, so you keep going in there and you keep taking out the weeds and you keep encouraging the flowers and laying more seeds, you will eventually have a garden full of flowers rather than a garden full of weeds. And so that's just my analogy to think about the way that we need to work with the brain regularly to make these changes. So I hope you found that interesting. So the actions for this week are to reflect on any previous cases that you might have had where you think this might have played a part. Think about some cases that you might have thought would be able to do what you'd asked them to do, but for some reason they just couldn't get the hang of it, or you couldn't change their posture or their movement patterns. Could this have been the fact that you needed to think a little bit differently about the way that you try to encourage the brain to grow these new pathways and to change? And also just review your rehab programs. Do you pay enough attention to this? Are you just thinking about strength and range of movement, or are you thinking about the brain-body connection? So if you're not signed up to Knowledge Nibbles and you would like to be, then please head over to our website where you can sign up at animalrehabhealth.academy/knowledge.